like to introduce my panelists. As Chris mentioned, we're going to be talking about lessons learned, people who are actually involved in projects at various stages involving biosequestration. Our first speaker to my right is John Quigley. John is Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, which is the agency in Pennsylvania that is in charge of its resources. Its 2.1 million acre state forest system, which is the largest certified state forest system in certainly the United States, maybe the world. Maybe just the U.S., and the 400,000 acre state park system. Before becoming Secretary of DCNR, John was Director of Legislative Services and Strategic Initiatives and the Chief of Staff at DCNR under Secretary Michael DeBerardinis. And in that position, John oversaw the management of a stakeholder process on carbon management, specifically focusing on use of the state's forests and soils for carbon sequestration and geologic sequestration as well. He's also been the mayor of Hazleton and was legislative director of Penn Future. To my immediate left will be the next speaker, Paul Harrison, who works for the Environmental Defense Fund, where he's the director of Mississippi River and East Coast Center for Rivers and Delta Lands, Water, and Wildlife Program, I believe. And he has his JD from Fordham and his BA from William and Mary. He also worked for DOJ for 6 years, and he's going to talk about an innovative program which really mixes some of the functions that the committee of the ABA that's sponsoring this, is the Committee on Climate Change, Sustainable Development, and Ecosystems, is involved in, because he's really using the ecosystem using wetlands recreation to restore ecosystem services and sequester carbon. Tiffany Potter will next speak, and Tiffany's just launched Streamline Inc., which does consulting for carbon and renewable energy markets. She has 12 years of experience in carbon and environmental asset transactions. She's worked, among others, for the Eco Products Fund and Point Carbon. She was director of the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. She received her BS in Forest Biology from UVM and her Master's of Environmental Management at Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Thank you. So we'll hear from John first.
Thanks, Bob. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully I can work this. It's nice to be here. Actually, it's nice to be out at Harrisburg. Pennsylvania just emerged from a budget process that ran 110 days late. And like many states around the country, we have been experiencing some difficult times budgetarily. And as Bob mentioned, part of my portfolio is to oversee the management of the largest block of publicly owned land east of the Mississippi, the Pennsylvania State Forest System, which is, I think, the largest certified sustainable forest in the United States. We also manage the state park system that actually won the national award last week as the best managed state park system in the United States. And we also do some pretty interesting work in geology and in some other areas. But it's nice to be out of Harrisburg because our budget has been cut like those of many other state agencies around the country. So it's always a pleasure to get away from that, at least for a little while, although I got to get back before the end of the day. I want to talk to you today about our work in terrestrial sequestration. And I'll say that my positioning here on the panel is a little bit of a misnomer in that my agency is an aspiring practitioner. We haven't yet done a project on the ground. We are trying to frame a project or two this year and into next year that will get us some of this experience, and I will be listening very closely to our other panelists. But the work that we have done around terrestrial sequestration at DCNR as the largest landowner in Pennsylvania really flows from this assumption that global warming is the single biggest threat to the natural heritage of Pennsylvania that we are responsible for managing, and the single biggest threat to the sustainability of our economy. And I wouldn't be a good DCNR secretary if I didn't say that, and if I didn't lead with some of these assertions and some of these assumptions. In my son's lifetime, he's a junior in high school, Pennsylvania's climate is migrating steadily southward, and we will be in the deep south, climate-wise, in my son's lifetime. The eastern half of the state will feel like southern Georgia, and the western half of the state is going to feel like northern Alabama. And this is the business as usual projection of the Union of Concerned Scientists using a high emissions scenario essentially by the end of this century. And I will also tell you that this model is conservative, and the reality is running ahead of the model. So if anything, we're going to cook a lot faster than UCS suggests. Some of the consequences for Pennsylvania are laid out here for you. We are the most flood-prone state in the country with 3,000 miles of streams, and we're going to see a lot more flooding. We're going to see the loss of one of our signature outdoor pastimes, trout fishing, trout are a cold water species, and we're going to lose them by the middle of the century. We'll see all of the other impacts that you see presented here, such as the loss of winter outdoor recreation. Right now there's a pretty robust snowmobile community in Pennsylvania. We do have some ski resorts, and they are going to go the way of the dodo, certainly in the next 50 years. And we're a major player. Pennsylvania emits 1% of the planet's global warming emissions. We're the number 3 state in emissions, only behind Texas and California. And we emit more global warming emissions than 106 developing countries combined. So we think, and Governor Rendell thinks, that we have a particular responsibility to take meaningful action and exert real leadership to change this situation and to illustrate a path forward for the country. So about 3 years ago, my predecessor, Mike DeBerardinis, asked me to convene a group called the Carbon Management Advisory Group, the CMAG. And its purpose was to think ahead. Assuming that national limits on carbon emissions are inevitable, which I think is a pretty fair assumption, many years too late, but certainly I think a reasonable assumption. And given our preponderance of coal-fired power, and indeed we're a net energy exporter with 1 out of every 3 electrons generated in Pennsylvania exported to other states, how are we going to fare? How are we going to cope as a Commonwealth? And are there, in fact, some competitive advantages by looking at our natural resources through a carbon lens? And I will mention that Bob McKinstry was kind enough to be one of the members of our Carbon Management Advisory Group, and he contributed a great deal to it. Again, why DCNR? We are the largest landowner in the state. We have a mission of sustainability to try to help shape a sustainable Pennsylvania. We have 2 million acres of state forest land that can help offset the Commonwealth's emissions and provide biomass feedstocks, and I'll talk very briefly about that in a second. And our Bureau of Topographic and Geologic Survey, the state geologist, has been a founding member of the Midwest Region Carbon Sequestration Partnership. So we've been very deeply involved in a lot of these issues. This Carbon Management Advisory Group report that we put out in May of 2008 is the product of the work of 65 stakeholders drawn from every appropriate group, from industry, academia, non-governmental organizations, governmental agencies, our traditional stakeholders, for example, in the timber industry, in the outdoor recreation community, and a lot of great DCNR staff. There's a link there to the report, which we're very proud of, and was characterized by none other than President Bill Clinton as world-class. We have been working with the Clinton Foundation on geologic sequestration, which I'm not going to talk about today. Would be happy to come back and do that. But we're very proud of this report, and I commend it to you. The report did look at a number of topics under terrestrial sequestration. We looked at the whole panoply of options: afforestation, forest management, wood products, and urban forestry. What is the role of land conservation and land preservation, which indeed has a global warming signature? We looked at the whole area of forest biomass energy feedstocks, have some very interesting factoids, despite the fact that Pennsylvania has 17 million acres of forests. If you sustainably removed all of the biomass that you could from that forest and converted it to gasoline, you'd offset 6% of the state's consumption. There's no magic bullet in the forest in terms of biomass, even with the advent of things like cellulosic ethanol. And again, that's a whole other subject. We looked at geologic sequestration. We looked at the role of registries and how Pennsylvania may participate in the development of what we greedily think about as a Pennsylvania-centric national system. Following our work and the release of our report in May of 2008, the Pennsylvania General Assembly passed Act 70, which convened a climate change advisory committee, which was charged with preparing a report on the impacts of climate change on Pennsylvania, developing a greenhouse gas inventory, assigning voluntary registries, and pivotally, developing a climate change action plan, which actually has just been posted on the Department of Environmental Protection's website, and I don't have a link for you, but it is posted on the state website. And that work, in large measure, builds on the work that DCNR did in May of 2008. All of that work, our CMAG report and the work of the State Climate Change Advisory Committee has reached a similar conclusion, that the state's natural resources, its land and its geology, are going to be crucial to sustained economic growth under the imposition of a federal carbon constraint. The question is, how do we do it? How do we tackle it? We looked, and I'll talk specifically about the role of the 17 million acres of forest land in Pennsylvania. We are the largest landowner, as I said, with 2 million acres. There are 500,000 private forest landowners in Pennsylvania, and we're seeing increasing and more rapid parcelization of the forest land in Pennsylvania, which is not a positive trend, not a favorable trend. The incentives to either sell your land for development or do something other nasty thing with it is increasing in Pennsylvania, and it is critically important for us now with this parcelization trend to look at the role of terrestrial sequestration and how private landowners in particular can benefit by sustainably managing their forest land. Some factoids. All of the annual growth of that 17 million acres of forest land, under the most optimistic set of assumptions, offsets about 5% of the state's emissions, about 5% of that 1% of total global warming emissions. And that's on a consumption basis. Remember, we're a net energy exporter, so 1 out of every 3 electrons are exported. We only consume 2 out of every 3 in Pennsylvania. So based on that calculation of what we consume, it's 5%. It's about 3% if you consider total energy generation in the state. And the question becomes, with that capacity, which is indeed is still important, 5% helps to close the alligator's jaw, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. How many slices of this do we have to close from the trajectory of current emissions to where we've got to get to stave off the impacts of climate change? Take as many slices out of this alligator's jaw as we can to close it. 5% is a meaningful number. So we looked in particular at forest land at these options. What is the carbon benefit to plant and restore forests, to protect forest land through conservation easements, to manage forest land more intensively to improve the uptake of carbon? What is the carbon signature, assuming this is wood and not plastic, what is the carbon signature of this stuff? This is carbon sequestration. And there's an economic value to this form of carbon sequestration because the wood products industry stands to benefit. How do we factor that in to help the wood products industry and to help sustainable working forests in Pennsylvania, and what are the policy implications? And how do you do urban forestry? We've launched a program called Tree Vitalize, which is attempting to reestablish urban forest cover in southeast Pennsylvania, particularly in the Philadelphia area, and we're trying to take that program statewide and plant 1 million trees over the next 5 years. Let's talk a little bit about land conservation. You probably are aware that when you develop forest land, when you convert it, when you cut the trees down and pave it over, there's a tremendous one-time release of carbon. And indeed, that's a major contributor to global warming, is the conversion of forest land to developed use. And not only do you release a lot of carbon when you clear forests, you lose the sequestration capacity. So how do you quantify those numbers? And what are the metrics? And what are real metrics to get at this question? Clearly, when we ran numbers and a number of different scenarios of what percentage of land was under development threat, and what are the costs of land preservation, what's the cost of an easement, and so forth. Under any number of scenarios, what falls out pretty quickly is that conserving forest land, reducing clearing, promoting working forests, sustainably managed forests, are very cost-effective carbon management policies. They are a hell of a lot cheaper than slapping a scrubber on a smokestack or doing carbon capture and storage, another area that we have delved into pretty well. When you look at the cost of carbon per ton, the forest is the cheapest way to go, or one of the cheapest ways to go, perhaps with the addition of soils. So there is real benefit to looking to the forest as a solution. There are obviously co-benefits: water quality, habitat, recreation, cleaner air, you name it. Urban forestry, planting trees in urban areas, is in fact cost negative because studies have shown that you reduce energy consumption in the built environment when you have shade. It reduces heating and cooling needs in urban environments. So there's actually, urban forestry is cost negative, and we need to be planting a lot more trees in cities across this country. The question is how you do this in the absence of $60 or more per ton carbon. What is the funding mechanism to enable this good stuff to happen? Or what are the mechanisms that are needed to make this good stuff happen? Right now, carbon credits are not the primary economic driver. Carbon is trading on the voluntary market in this country. Let's pick a number, $5 a ton, which is probably optimistic. That is nowhere near where it needs to be the primary economic driver of any project, whether it's urban street trees or land conservation, forest preservation, what have you. We also looked at registries. What will the rules of the coming carbon game look like in this country? And how do we encourage participation by private landowners, by the owners of the state's resources outside of the public domain? How do we design registries and the parameters to position our state favorably, to be very Pennsylvania-centric? And we're looking in particular at the Climate Action Reserve and the Voluntary Carbon Standard. The Climate Registry is another vehicle that we have looked at. But the world is in a state of flux, and there are bills right now in Washington that we hope to help influence, again, to position the value of forests in this whole equation. The question that we face now as a wannabe practitioner is, when do we jump into this? With the rules changing, the price of carbon low, with developing expertise, some of which you'll hear after the amateur gets off the dais and gets to the pros, when do we jump in as a public landowner and a public land manager? That's the question we're wrestling with right now. The plan for my agency is to, within the next 15 months, do one or more pilot projects. We're working with the Pacific Forest Trust and have an ambition to have Governor Rendell in Pennsylvania and Governor Schwarzenegger in California join hands across the country and do some model demonstration projects around forest conservation that we think will be nationally significant. So that's the ambition that we've set out for ourselves, and we're trying to figure out now how to do it. What is the role of a carbon price? What other funding do we need to bring to bear because we can't do it with a carbon trade? How do we continue to refine our expertise as an agency and share that expertise with the 500,000 private forest landowners in the Commonwealth? How do we work with a very active community of land trusts and land conservancies to make sure that they have an opportunity to not only look over our shoulder, help us shape the policy in a very transparent way, but maybe actually get an appetite for this and develop some expertise of their own so that this practice can take root literally in Pennsylvania. And clearly we would like to influence the direction of federal policy. We are hoping to work with our senators, Specter and Casey, on the Senate version of federal climate legislation to, at a minimum, provide funding for conservation easements. Around the world, you've heard that I'm sure you've heard that the developing world and the forests in the developing world have been looked to as carbon sinks. And there's a lot of emphasis on preserving rainforest and preserving large blocks of forest land and preventing conversion in the developing world. We need to do the same thing in the United States. Pennsylvania is one of the most rapidly sprawling states in the country. We chew up a hell of a lot of land each year for development, even though our population is stagnant. So what are the policies and incentives that can turn that situation around and protect land without going necessarily head-to-head with the development community? Where are the win-win opportunities? That's where we want to go in Pennsylvania, is to find the win-wins, find the examples that can work across the country. Governor Rendell has an ambition to be a leader, even in the last year and 2 months of his term, to be a national leader in this field. I think it's fair to say that he's done some great work on alternative energy and energy conservation. We've enacted one of the most ambitious energy conservation laws in the United States last year, and the governor would like to add to his resume, frankly, and to contribute to the national debate and national policy around global warming, so that we, who are kind of the poster child for global warming, a state with a history of heavy industry and coal mining, can become an example of progressive and enlightened carbon policy going forward. So that's the challenge that he's laid out to me, and that's something that we're very excited about, and I hope to learn today from some folks who have gone before and perhaps apply what they've learned. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and now we'll turn to Paul Harrison.
Great, thanks, John. Thanks, Bob. So I want to talk to you guys a bit. I think that at the end of this, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions, the big questions of how this works and how this intersects with national policy are really important. And we need to get into that a little bit as a summary of this conversation. I want to talk to you a little bit about a state that's very different than Pennsylvania politically, but is facing one of probably the largest ecological collapse in the United States right now, something that very few people are actually aware of. And we have a 10 NGO coalition, national groups like Environmental Defense Fund, the Audubon Society, National Wildlife Federation, but local and community-based organizations that are working to reverse this collapse, and actually in close partnership with Bobby Jindal and the governor of Louisiana. One of the obvious issues is, how do we pay for this? So I want to talk to you a bit about, give you a little bit of briefing on the issues with the Mississippi River Delta and the collapse of that very economically and environmentally critical ecosystem, and also how we're working with the state to address both the on-the-ground issue as well as how we pay for it through both the voluntary market and potentially mandatory market. So the Mississippi River Delta, this is where New Orleans is built on. It's why New Orleans is where it is the 7th largest delta in the world. It drains 41% of the continental United States. The combined Mississippi and Missouri River is the 4th largest river in the world. And this is an area, the delta where the river comes out into the Gulf of Mexico is economically and environmentally significant in a way that very few people are aware of. This area supplies the United States with 27% of its oil and gas, 32% of its natural gas. The ports rank as number one in the nation by tonnage. The energy and agricultural production of the heartland of America goes out through the ports of New Orleans. It's a major bird migration route. The majority of migratory birds, ducks, neotropical songbirds, come back on their migrations, their long migrations through the Mississippi River Delta and its vast wetlands. So if you can imagine these little bright blue birds that have just flown 2,000-3,000 miles and they're out of energy and they need to land somewhere, and they evolved to land on this lush landscape of swamps and forests that would feed them and sustain them. The current projections with the man-made ecological collapse combined with global warming is that this system will be completely gone at 2100, which means that those songbirds will be gone. Not to talk about ducks. So storm buffering. Obviously, New Orleans, we all know, very vulnerable to hurricanes. There have been 4 major hurricanes in the past 4 years, and that has cost the United States in the range of about $200 billion to recover from. So this is an expensive restoration project, but New Orleans and those communities were built in a place where they had miles and miles of absorbing and protective swamp and marsh in front of them, and that's mostly gone now. So New Orleans didn't move to the sea. We moved the sea to New Orleans. And we have the potential, because of this river, to reverse that. And finally, this is highly productive fisheries. It's the largest fishery in the lower 48. When you go to Maryland now and you go to a crab house, those crabs come from Louisiana. Oysters, shrimp, massively productive. And 90% of the creatures that live in the Gulf of Mexico spend a significant portion of their life cycle in the delta wetlands. Again, if that disappears, collapse of that system. So the critical thing you need to know about this system is that it is a river delta. It was built over about the past 7,000 years, a blink of an eye in geological terms, by the fact that the Mississippi River is constantly taking that water and sediment it takes from the 41% of the United States, constantly seeking the shortest route to the Gulf of Mexico. So it basically swings around like a big fire hose. When the main portion of the channel is in one place, it's putting out sediment, building land. Other places will erode from the sea, but it evens out over time. The fundamental thing is we've stopped that system. So since the early 1900s, we have lost over 2,300 square miles of land. So that's the equivalent of the state of Delaware disappearing. It's equivalent of, for any, you guys have West Coast geological references, it's equivalent of Marin and Sonoma County being wiped off the map completely. And it's about a third of this entire system. And this land loss continues. And in fact, this map shows the projected land loss to 2050. We fast forwarded during Katrina and actually are pretty much at this stage right now. So if you can look at that and imagine all that red turning from vibrant ecosystem and protective marshes and swamps into open water, and that's basically what's happened. Causes of land loss, we control this river. We control the Mississippi River we built levees on it for flood protection purposes and to allow navigation. This is an international deep draft shipping channel. That's an artificial situation. But that stopped the river from switching around, and it also stopped the river from overflowing its banks and putting water and sediment out into the marsh. This is a big pile of mud, basically, so it's naturally subsiding, but we've moved that along by digging lots of holes and sucking out the oil and gas, and that's actually causing the land to go down lower. So the big issue here is not sea level rise, it's relative sea level rise. Saltwater intrusion. We cut channels through this landscape all over the place. And where naturally you had these sort of curving bayous and very slow, shallow water bodies, and you now have big 30, 40-foot deep, 600-foot wide channels just directing the saltwater up into the fresh and the brackish system. Storms, part of the natural system, but as global warming happens, those storms are changing in terms of intensity and frequency, and that's a big issue. And obviously also as the system has become weakened, it has much less resiliency to deal with those storms. Herbivory, we imported nutria and let them go because we were going to hunt them for fur. Well, it's like putting a goat on your lawn. Boy, it's going to be close cropped all the time. They go for the roots. They destroy things. And finally, obviously, sea level rise from climate change. So our overall goal here is we need to restore the natural function of the Mississippi River. White House Council on Environmental Quality Chairwoman Nancy Sutley was down last week, and she pointed out that we have 50% of the United States, the population, living in a coastal zone. Climate change is coming. We have to get ready to build the resiliency and the adaptive capacity of these communities. And if there's one place we can do it, it's Louisiana, because we have this massive land building machine that is the Mississippi River. It's also going to give us the tools that we're going to need in coastal communities across the country. So again, this map is important because you can see this is actually during the 2008 spring flood of the Mississippi River, and you can kind of see where that sediment is coming off up there, and then you can see north of it, it's very clear water. Well, that's where all that land loss is. So we need to get that sediment. What we're doing right now is actually purposely dumping it into deep waters off the continental shelf, bring it back into the system. And there's a set of projects set up to do that. These are actually authorized in Congress, and it just gives you a scope of it. I'll go through quickly. But you can see that this is a landscape scale issue with specific projects in it. And the important thing here for this conversation about bio-sequestration is that this system is basically a natural carbon sequestration machine. Because of that subsidence, because of that huge input of sediment and fresh water from the Mississippi River, it has unparalleled ability to sequester carbon. So this is an image from a place called Carnarvon, and it shows you a natural history from 1927, which was the last time that the river burst its banks and flooded this area. And so what you can see, that white section is the sediment and material that it put down in basically a month. And you can see the scale from the gentleman's boot there. So that's a significant amount of land that was built in a matter of months. But what you also see is what happened between 1927 and 2002. That's just land that the plants put down. That's just they're taking nutrients out of the air and they're putting it down, and that's sinking down into the ground. And naturally, it comes in and gets covered up by the river, and this process goes on and on. And that's not to mention where you have big swamps with huge cypress trees, talking about the wood sequestration. So a very powerful system in terms of carbon sequestration. I'll throw out one more number here. If you go back to this map, the 2,300 square miles, that's land that shouldn't have been lost. That's carbon sequestered that has been released. And it's the numbers show that it's about equivalent. If we avoid the current rate of land loss, it's about the equivalent of removing 80 million cars a year. So it's very, very important, both in terms of the ability to enhance the system and add more sequestration, but also to stop the collapse of the system for human reasons, for ecological reasons, but also to take carbon out of the air. So let me talk to you about the program just really quickly. Where we are, we're in a relationship with the state of Louisiana. We're advising them. We're helping to bring in technical resources. We've gone through a phase 1 analysis, which means scientific and marketability feasibility. We brought in experts, and the decision that they've made is that this is not only scientifically feasible, but it's marketable, both in the current voluntary market and likely in a mandatory market. There are policy questions about making sure that this is actually allowed in a mandatory market, because this is very different from farms and forestry and sort of more controllable situations. So we're at the stage now where we know that, so that's just a phase 1 feasibility analysis. There are additional questions that have to be resolved. And so we're going into a process of doing phase 2 more in-depth data collection and analysis and protocol development, but also some pilot projects where we're going to run these as if they were sequestration projects, probably using some corporate donations because the co-benefits are so huge, but also some state money, and just practice doing a project that sequesters carbon. We've got a couple really great ones to do it. The big science questions, and these go into policy, are what's the baseline condition? How do you treat the avoided loss? Additionality, obviously, we don't have the funding right now to restore this system, but we do have government programs that are focused on trying to get there. And if you're in a market that asks the question of, well, was this going to happen already? That's it. You have to define a point at which it's additional or it's not additional. And finally, the question of permanence. This is a very dynamic system, and because it's so storm impacted, that's part of why it's so productive. But also the question of, okay, if I do a restoration project here and I tell you you're going to get carbon credits for the next 50 years, and 5 years down the line a major hurricane slams into that resource, how do you handle that kind of thing? You probably do it through insurance. You probably do it through treating this whole thing as a program rather than individual projects. But getting into those details and refining them and actually having a plan at the end of phase 2, which hopefully is within the next 6 months to a year, is our plan. And there's a paper in the materials that goes into some more detail on the next steps in research. And so we get back on time, I'll skip over that. But just really quickly, what are the lessons learned and the issues raised from looking at how we use carbon sequestration to move these projects forward and also to fund them? Number one, science absolutely has to drive the development of your program. The voluntary market has varying levels of criticality about your project. Is this real sequestration or is this PR? If science doesn't drive that and you get sucked into that, when we have a mandatory system with regulations, you're going to get really hit hard. And these are complex, and if you haven't addressed these issues, you're going to find nasty surprises. At scale, you're going to need a program. I think that this is a fundamental thing. It's different in these big ecosystem restoration projects than Farmer John changes his crop management practices. There's a lot of balancing and a lot of issues. One of the things that the scientists say about this is the other thing that's happening with this land loss is we're basically taking a very complex system and turning it into a monoculture of just saltwater marsh, which will eventually go away. But we want to get back to that healthy, kind of complex biosphere. And if we do that, each of those kinds of systems, is it a cypress swamp? Is it brackish marsh? What is it? Each of those systems will need different rules as to how much carbon is there and how we manage them. And very, very finally, venture capital funds are absolutely critical. This is both cheap and expensive to do. Setting up this whole project is probably going to cost us $2 to $3 million. And the scale of what's being done here, it's nothing. But, actually getting that money to get started, and some people who are going to say, you know what, this is just exciting. Let's put some initial investment into it is absolutely critical. And luckily, we've had that support from the state of Louisiana and from our funders. But I think when you look across the scale of innovation that will be needed to bring these kinds of ideas to fruition, there's going to be a lot more need for VC. So that's the news from Louisiana. Thanks.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from Tiffany Potter.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the introduction, Bob. I am Tiffany, and today I'm going to reflect on my experiences as a trained and professional forester, my experience working in finance, and my experience working at Point Carbon, where I studied the North American offset market for 2 years and launched a trading analytics tool called Carbon Project North America, which is now used by 40 different hedge funds, private equity firms, and major banks all around the world. It tracks 700 different offset project types in North America. It tracks performance history of players involved. It tracks about 1,000 different players that are in the market. There is a forward price curve, and there is a plethora of other information, including verification reports and other materials that will help practitioners like yourself or potential practitioners like yourself understand the market. I'm going to use this collection of experiences in December to launch my own consulting practice. And it will help folks in the environmental markets understand sort of the maze of moving environmental policy, rapidly changing sort of the financial market, and then all the different offset project types that are out there and how you can actually monetize some of those credits that can be created from them. So today I'm going to talk to you about one angle of environmental markets, and that is forest carbon transactions in North America. But I have one quick disclaimer, and since we're in Columbia Law School, I'm sure that you can all appreciate a good legal disclaimer. So first of all, the information presented here is not provided to be or considered to be an offer of any solicitation to sell any services. And the information, a lot of this information is actually from publicly available sources, and intellectual property is provided from Point Carbon with permission. Information protected by non-disclosure agreements and other contractual obligations is not included, for the record. So today I'm going to discuss a couple different elements. I'm going to run through Forest Carbon Projects 101. Can I see a hand of how many foresters may be in the room? I know we have one. We've got two. Okay, great. His very brief history of the land sector in cap and trade. I'm going to review forest offset carbon projects. I'm going to review 2 case studies, 2 landmark deals, deal structures, forest carbon capital and who writes the checks, and then review a few challenges in project development and discuss the forest carbon scorecard, which was developed by Manomet, which I peer reviewed, which has about 43 different variables on how you put together a carbon offset project and score it. So just real briefly, the forest carbon offset market, or the land sector market, is divided into 3 general categories. And I know some elements were discussed in the panel before, at least in terms of soil carbon, so I won't go into that too much. But we have forest carbon projects. Forest carbon is a tricky thing because a lot of people don't have a technical background in it. And so there are about 5 different types that you should know, and I'm not going to get too detailed. But the first one is the most misunderstood offset type, and that is improved forest management. If you improve the way a forest sequesters carbon, you can get credits in the market. You can do this by reduced impact logging, where you log in the wintertime, where you do extended rotation of trees, so you're logging them at 30 years instead of 20 years, or 100 years instead of 50 years. You're planting native species or species that grow a little bit faster, and you're pruning. You're helping trees grow faster. There's conservation forest management, and that's where you are protecting land where there is a site-specific threat, or you can tell that there are conversion trends in a particular county that are showing that that area is threatened. There are RED projects where you're basically swapping concessions, logging concessions for protection, and you're sort of folding in a lot of other aspects of forest carbon projects. You're involving reforestation, afforestation, and other elements of improved forest management in sort of a RED project, and that generally happens in developing countries. You also have afforestation and reforestation, and these 2 types are basically the same. There's just sort of a time component. In the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, reforestation projects are projects that are done on lands that have not been degraded for 10 years, and afforestation projects are done on lands that have been degraded for over 10 years. And in the California Climate Action Registry, the rules are sort of flipped there, but it's generally you're replanting trees or planting trees. With soil carbon projects, you have rangeland management, and that's basically where you are lessening the intensity of cattle on property. You also have conservation tillage projects, where you are lowering the intensity of which soil is cultivated, so you're not exposing soil to aerobic processes as quickly. And there's sort of all different variations of how this is done. Then you also have avoided conversion, and this is a project in grasslands where you can pay farmers to put on permanent conservation easements as opposed to convert land for, say, biofuels or corn. There are a bunch of different offset types that don't sort of fit into those 2 categories, and so this is my other category, where you've got wetland assimilation, where you're using municipal waste to restore coastal areas in, say, Louisiana. Nitrogen fertilization is where you're lessening the application of fertilizer on a farm. So a brief history of the land sector. How we've come to have this sort of myriad of different project types comes from a sort of convoluted and difficult to track history of the forest sector. And so I've just decided to break it down into sort of 5 points that I think most practitioners should need to know. And I broke them down into 2 categories, which I call red light categories and green light issues. So what put the brakes on forest carbon to begin with was basically the Kyoto Protocol. Terrestrial carbon is included in national GHG inventories, but AFLU, which stands for Agriculture, Forestry, and Other Land Use Types, was excluded from the Clean Development Mechanism. Basically, the methodologies to develop a lot of these forestry and land sector projects were deemed too complicated for developing offset projects under the CDM. At the same time, the European Union restricted forestry from the European trading system. Slowly, though, things began to change, especially in the U.S. Green light issue, the Chicago Climate Exchange used USDA models for setting default carbon sequestration rates in agricultural ecological zones and permitted some folks to trade offsets using soil carbon offsets in the CCX. Then there was the UNFCCC Bali Declaration, and here there was a commitment made to at least try to overcome some of the methodological issues in the post-2012 agreement. The VCS, meanwhile, that stands for the Voluntary Carbon Standard. They decided to look at some of these complex methodological issues raised when the CDM excluded forestry projects, and decided to look at issues for how do you really confirm that you can have permanence in some of these projects. And so they came up with tools for figuring out how that would work. And then meanwhile, on the U.S. compliance side, all the major trading systems, both the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the California Climate Action Registry, and almost every single bill on the Hill had provisions for forestry. So this was a major sea change for forest carbon. So what I'd like to do is look at the history of offset types in the U.S. and sort of the distribution. So this data comes from the Carbon Project North America, the analytics tool that I launched at Point Carbon, and breaks down the various different types. And as you can see, the most common and the most abundant offset type is landfill gas. Do we have a... Is landfill gas. The second most abundant offset type is geological sequestration. This is carbon capture and geologic storage. And basically, you're taking carbon and you're pumping this into saline aquifers and storing it, or using it for enhanced oil recovery. The third most common is soil sequestration. And those are basically the no-till or conservation tillage projects. And then I want to point out that forestry is a very small component of this. So these soil projects are mostly affiliated with the Chicago Climate Exchange. In 2007, I looked at all the different projects and all the different standards, and about half of the market, offset market in the U.S., was represented by the CCX. And 80% of the offsets traded in that system were soil offsets. The CCX gets a lot of criticism because there are some pundits that believe that some of these projects really are not additional. They're not going above and beyond business as usual to store carbon. I'm not here to defend or support the CCX. I'm just here to point out that I think what the CCX is trying to do is actually quite admirable. If you look at soil carbon in terms of global stocks, carbon stocks and global systems, it's an essential part of the equation in terms of sequestering carbon. Some of the projects, perhaps some of the project types could have been done a little differently, but what a lot of folks didn't realize was what a small percentage of the CCX was forestry. Moving through the market, so looking at 2009, I'm going to draw a clean slate with the market because I think a lot of things are changing. Forestry as an offset type is growing. So we've got landfill gas, agricultural waste, and forestry. Forestry representing the third most abundant offset type starting in 2009. So why is this happening? There's a lot of positive market signals coming from Capitol Hill. The Kerry-Boxer bill has specific provisions for a clear route to market for forest carbon, and there are other exciting things going on. Just yesterday, Bloomberg published a story on how the EU ETS is backtracking on their decision to exclude forestry and potentially could include it in 2012. So what I decided to do was, out of those 75 projects, pull out the forest carbon projects that are most likely compliance grade. This is a very common question in the market. What projects are likely to count under a federally regulated system? So I pulled out 10 projects in particular. Everything that's in gray, I just want to point out, are projects that are pulled from the California Climate Action Registry. And there's one, I can't tell if you can tell that it's slightly in green at the bottom. In different bills on the Hill, at least the most popular ones right now are the ones that are gaining the most momentum. There are provisions for offsets that if they've been created under regionally recognized or state-endorsed systems, that they are most likely to count. So we could look at RGGI and CAR, the Climate Action Registry, as producing offsets that are likely to count in the future. There are 9 projects that are listed there, and I have information here on 7. Another project that I think is likely to be compliance grade is a project that I'm going to go into more detail. And this is a project that has been registered with the American Carbon Registry, and it's a project done between Duke and Green Trees. So looking at all of the California Climate Action Registry projects, there's about 100 listed. Only about 9 of those are forestry. So forestry is still a very small part of the market. What I'd like to do now is just pull out 2 projects that were on that greater list and talk about them in more detail. The first project was just recently announced, and it's the largest forest carbon transaction to date in North America. And it's a deal done between 2 parties. One, Sierra Pacific Industries. They're I think it's the second or one of the largest landowners in the country, with 2 million acres under management in California and Washington. I think they're the second largest producer of timber as well. They did a transaction involving 60,000 acres with the Eco Products Fund. It's a fund that's managed by Equator LLC and New Forest. They have $100 million devoted to developing eco assets. In this project, 20,000 acres of giant sequoia will be protected. Pacific Fisher will be introduced. And basically this transaction was set up so that SPI will be paid another fee per resale. And I'm going to go into the deal structures in a minute here. The second transaction I'd like to talk about is the Duke Energy trade, and that was the one on the bottom in green with the American Carbon Registry. Duke Energy agreed to buy 250,000 offsets from 1,700 acres in a deal that has a protocol approved by the American Carbon Registry. They may seek permission, or they may seek offsets under the California Action Registry, and this is important to mention because that registry doesn't have rules for aggregating. In the Chicago Climate Exchange, you can aggregate lands that are less than 10,000 acres, but you can't really do that at a lot of other places, and so this is going to be difficult for forest carbon development because a lot of lands in the U.S. are owned by small private landowners. So it'll be interesting to see if the CAR approves these aggregation rules. If they don't, we're not going to see a lot of the smaller forest transactions, and there's really, it's going to be limited, I think, to see how big the market could grow if you only allow projects that are maybe 20,000 acres or more. So basically, these credits are going to be registered next year, and this deal was done as a forward payment. So basically, the credits were bought in advance, and there was a forward strip. And Green Trees, which is the developer, pays their landowners about $350 per acre. So what kind of deals are done in forest carbon? The same kind of deals are done in forest carbon as in any sort of offset market, and almost like any other commodity. There are three general types of deal structures. The first one is a revenue split, and it's most commonly called an upside split upon success. Noble Carbon Credits, I've heard in the market, does a deal like this. They offer an offset developer $1 for a ton today, with the idea that they will pay them $10 if that offset credit is stamped with approval by the USDA. The problem with this kind of deal for a project developer is it means you get a little bit of money up front, but you have to shoulder all of the risk while you're developing the project. And there's a likelihood that that project may never be approved. So if it's not successful, you're not going to be paid. Second kind of deal is a pre-sale, and that's like the Duke to Green Trees deal, where you have a company coming forward and basically looking at the price of carbon in the future. Let's say a credit under the California Action Registry is $20 in 2010. What a company like Duke will pay is $4 today to have that credit. The advantage is the developer gets the money in hand now, they get to share the risk, but the tons are heavily discounted. Third kind of deal is payment on delivery. So basically, you can get a little bit of money up front. It's not a lot. If you have $1 million deal, you can get 10%, but the rest of the deal is paid upon verification, and that the buyer doesn't get any future rights to any other credit. Sometimes projects can overperform, and so you sometimes want to have access to that overperformance to be able to sell those credits. So who are writing these checks and who are doing these deals? I have a list here. It doesn't represent the whole market, but does represent sort of some of the bigger players. There are about 5 companies right now that are making deals. This does not represent end users, companies who are going to retire these offsets. Blue Source, their claim to fame is they have one of the largest greenhouse gas portfolios in the U.S. They've done landfill project deals, energy efficiency deals. They just did a forestry project that they recently announced, and they have about $500 million, maybe more, to write checks. Sequest Capital, claim to fame is Ken Newcomb left Goldman Sachs to start this firm. They've done hydro projects, wind, and energy efficiency, and they have about $500,000 to $5 million per project to develop. The Eco Products Fund, which I mentioned before, joint venture between New Forest Advisory and Equator, they have $100 million under management, and they've developed bioconservation certificates in Malaysia. They've developed an avoided conversion project in the sort of Great Plains, and they've just done an improved forest management project with SPI. Finite Carbon, they're backed by a venture capital firm called TL Ventures, and they have $1.6 billion under management. They're only doing forestry. They do not disclose how much money they have, but they have several million to work with. The Noble Carbon Group, this is a group that's developed 65 million certified emission reductions already. Those are credits traded under the Kyoto Protocol. In total, 320 million have been approved by the UN. So you can see by these numbers that Noble has a significant share of that market. They've developed many different offset types, not forestry, but they're looking to. So challenges in project development. At Point Carbon, I looked at about 600 different projects. And one of the first things I noticed is that there's a whole range of the way in which project developers convey information. And it's amazing how many of them see so many dollar signs from these deals. They see so many zeros and they just want to develop these projects. And they don't necessarily take the time to put their branding together. Oftentimes, they don't know how big their project is, how many years they want their project to go on for. And so it's amazing how it's important as a practitioner, if you do go on to develop a project or work with someone who might, to make sure that they take the time to develop sort of the branding for their project. Most of these developers, they get, when I was working at Equator, I received dozens and dozens of proposals a month. So you basically only have one shot with each of these firms. So you want to make sure that you put your best foot forward. And so you really want to present a very clear project idea note. This is a very common piece of material that's used to develop international offset types. And it's just a one-page sheet that talks about how many offsets you're going to produce, where it's going to be, who owns the greenhouse gas rights, very simple stuff. Another big challenge that I see coming up is with monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification. Right now, a lot of protocols have just been finalized, which means a lot of these projects have never been field tested, especially by practitioners. So I think there's going to be a whole nother round of issues that have never even been addressed because no one has ever actually tried these protocols out in the forest. Moving policy targets. I think that's going to be a part of some of our panel discussions, so I won't dive into it too much. But of course, there's a rapidly evolving policy landscape, and what could be a credit today may not be a credit 10 years from now. I think this little slide says that, sorry, but the firing squad prefers a moving target. I don't think you can see that there. And then, of course, deal structures. It's really hard to get the deal structure perfectly right because a lot of developers may miss out on the upside if the market takes off. A lot of companies who are investing money may lose a lot of money if the market never takes off. So there's definitely going to be winners and losers in this game, and I mean that's sort of part of the fun. So last but not least, the Forest Carbon Scorecard. If you're not familiar to forestry and you want to look at the different elements that go into developing a project, I recommend that you look at this scorecard that is now in your binders. This looks at 43 different questions derived from analysis of different registries and different certification standards. And it basically looks at 8 different elements. There are yes and no questions that you can go through to look at contract structure, baselines, additionality, permanence leakage, co-benefits, etc. It was developed by a group that has done a lot of data-driven conservation science, and they asked me to peer review the scorecard. It goes through all the different registries. It goes through the California Climate Action Registry, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it comes up with a really good template for how you assess if a project is really a high-quality one or not. So thank you for your attention today. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think we can kick off some questions for the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tiffany. And I'm going to start the panel discussion with a couple questions, and I'm going to jump in the middle rather than our first because several of you mentioned the fact that one of the reasons you're looking at biological sequestration in part is because of the ability to generate co-benefits, particularly where projects generate additional ecosystem services. As you mentioned, flood control. People have looked at the idea of forests as producing pollution control. And of course, as I mentioned before, our committee, our ABA committee, is involved in looking at ecosystem services as well. What role, if any, do you see or have other additional ecosystem services or other credits like flood or water pollution control credits played in your planning or implementation? Tiffany, I'll let you go first.
I think what I'll do is maybe answer it in a different way. So on behalf of Equator, there are some elements to projects that I can't discuss. But I think what's important to look at is sort of what you're trying to get at, Bob, with your question. And in terms of in the future, will project developers use co-benefits in their projects, or what's the likelihood that they will, persist? And I think it's important, unfortunately, to look at how we're evolving. We're moving towards a mandatory compliance regime where utilities are going to have to buy these offsets, and they're going to be purchasing them hopefully at the least cost, because a lot of the costs may go to the will go to the ratepayer. And so I am a big fan of co-benefits. I mean, I wouldn't be in this. This is how I got started. I started as a wildlife biologist, and I want to develop projects that have these co-benefits. But I'm beginning to realize that a project can be high quality and not necessarily have co-benefits. And because the idea is we're going to be moving towards a system that develops cheap offsets to lower emissions in the climate.
I was getting in part about
Yep.
credits.
Yep.
Says
Oh.
wetlands banking,
Okay.
water pollution credits for water pollution trading, and maybe Paul is particularly involved in that area with the Mississippi Delta.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a perfect question, because you really in a big ecosystem, similar I think to what you're looking at in Pennsylvania, is your driver how much money you're going to get from the carbon market? Is it how much carbon you're pulling out of the air for the larger question of what are we doing for climate change, or is your driver your co-benefits? And in Louisiana, the decision really so far has been that your driver is your co-benefits. In fact, the state has a master plan for restoration and protection, and on the broad scale, where they are going to go with projects is going to be defined by the ecological response and by the protection benefits. There are other ecosystem services markets or potential markets that are being considered. If you do this right, the demand for big levee systems goes down. So getting the Army Corps of Engineers and Congress to sort of credit you for the fact that you didn't demand further big engineered infrastructure. The Mississippi River has a huge agricultural pollution problem from nitrogen upstream. There's discussions of imposing TMDLs under the Clean Water Act and actually setting up a trading system so that if you're putting water into the marsh, it will actually thrive off of this excess nutrients in the water. And that allows someone upstream to manage their farm differently. You shift monies that way. So there's a very big interest in the state there of putting together an overall framework for how these different ecosystem services markets fit together, and carbon is just one element of that. But again, I think it's very important up front to define what your primary goal is in a program, because it will be important for how you sell it, for how you market those co-benefits. I'll give you one last example. There's a project. It's actually the Central Wetlands. You talked about the Wetlands Assimilation Project. It's a cypress forest that used to envelop the lower Ninth Ward and protect New Orleans from the east. And it was the backyard for low-income working-class community, and it was this massive intertwining of cypress trees that actually has incredible power to break down storm surge and waves. And that was destroyed by a Army Corps of Engineers project that was put in the 1950s and 60s. You can see it from downtown New Orleans. So you can obviously imagine that if you are looking at, well, am I going to invest in a landfill project to collect methane, or am I going to invest in protecting this iconic national community that was a tragedy, and you're a big corporation, you're McDonald's or you're the NFL, which you're going to value more? There's a value quotient there that's different than just, okay, how many tons of carbon am I removing? So you want to make your program able to take advantage of those kinds of things. But if you go down that path, people become skeptical. So you also need to have this very defined role about what your overall purpose is in managing this ecosystem, so that they know that they can trust you, because you can say, okay, but this fits into the master plan that was put together before we came here to market this to you.
And in Pennsylvania, I would say that the co-benefits are the driver, and we're trying to figure out a role for carbon in the work. About 6 years ago, we passed an initiative called Growing Greener 2, which was a $650 million bond issue, the largest environmental bond issue in the state's history. And about a third of that came to my agency, and one of the primary purposes to which we put the money is land preservation, land conservation. And we purchased or eased something like 60,000 acres of ground working with the land trust community over the last 6 years. And in each and every instance, the driver has been the co-benefits, whether it's habitat corridors, whether it's riparian buffer planning to help reduce the nutrient load in the Chesapeake Bay. Pennsylvania is a big contributor to that. Whether it's an afforestation project on abandoned mine land that we've reclaimed through federal funding. The driver has always been the co-benefits. The question for us, because primarily, if you look at it in a narrow sense, this Growing Greener bond issue, this $650 million, the funding runs out next December. It goes to zero. So there is no, right now, permanent dedicated source of funding for environmental projects, for ecosystem services projects in Pennsylvania. The question that presents to us is, can we creatively use a carbon price to help replace some of the funding that was otherwise available to do these projects? And what is the role, what is the magnitude of that? Clearly it's not going to be enough, so we have to find a mix and match. But right now, all of the projects that you could term ecosystem services are driven completely by co-benefits.
Did you want to make another comment? You're hopping in. The House has now passed the American Clean Energy and Security Act, Waxman-Markey. The Boxer-Kerry has been introduced in the Senate. But we still really don't know what the shape of the federal program is going to be. Both, of course, have offsets as an important part of them. How has uncertainty about the final shape of the United States climate program affected your ability to actually implement the bio-sequestration projects? And in some cases you're in the planning. On the other hand, is it beneficial since maybe you see it as an ability to shape the development of this project?
I'll start as the wannabe. In one sense, it's paralyzing because we don't know what the rules of the game are going to be. So again, where do you jump in? But on the other hand, there is an opportunity here. And very practically, and I'll talk politics here for a second because I am a recovering politician from previous days. We have a Senate race in Pennsylvania. Senator Specter is running for re-election now as a Democrat. And we Democrats welcome the senator to our party. But he has to burnish his environmental credentials. And he is on the Environmental and Public Works Committee that is going to wrench on the Senate version of Waxman-Markey. So what are the opportunities to talk to Senator Specter in a very specific and focused way about, Senator, here's a project we'd like to do, a model demonstration project that will demonstrate the value of forest carbon offsets and conservation easements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Carbon price isn't doing it for us. We really need some help. And we need in the federal bill a provision to fund conservation easements as part of the package. There's an entree here. A very practical, hard-nosed political entree here that we are looking at in a very focused way to see if we can position a project to not only maybe get some funding to get it off the ground, but to help shape the eventual construct that the Senate comes up with. So there are some real opportunities here.
Well, I won't talk about the Louisiana delegation because that's complicated, but we could talk for an hour on what it would take to get Mary Landrieu on the climate bill, and she may be one of those 2 or 3 that are absolutely critical for that 60th vote required for cloture. So it's something we're definitely thinking about. I think the way that we have handled this with the state of Louisiana, ironically, and I think you see this, the governor has gotten more grief from the right than the left for his climate policy, and obviously that matters more to him because he's a conservative. But the way that we've dealt with it is to simply say we need to make sure that the protocols that we develop and the science that we finalize, and I want to be very clear with people that wetlands assimilation is incredibly powerful, but there's a couple asterisks there in terms of carbon greenhouse gas sequestration, and those relate primarily to methane and nitrogen. which are much more powerful greenhouse gases than carbon. So, getting the science absolutely locked down in terms of how we manage and make sure that those gases aren't a problem, and making sure that you meet all of the potential standards, has really forced the state to say we need to make sure these programs are done in a true gold standard manner. And so it's driving the program to some extent to get some work done on the ground so that we're able to really plug into these discussions on the Hill. And it's also driving a real sort of standard of excellence in how this program is put together. So I think it's a good thing, but it is a real danger because there's a significant potential that either purposely or possibly inadvertently that this kind of large-scale ecosystem restoration with aquatic resources could be written out of the bill or the regulations sort of unthinkingly. So we're very, very concerned about that.
Talking with other product developers, it is disconcerting that policy evolves so quickly. But I'd have to say that from tracking policy since 2006, carbon policy, I noticed that there is some very similar, there's a thread throughout all the different bills that if you listen to the policy discussion closely enough, you can kind of see which way the wind is blowing. So in 2006, I believe there were 7 different bills in the Hill. In 2007, there were 11 different bills in the Hill. And so from each bill, sort of the best of the best pieces are taken from one and wrapped into another. So you can kind of see what isn't changing and which way the conversation is headed. And so I've noticed that for project developers who are not tracking the policy debate closely, they are in a little bit more of a difficult position than those that are.
There's been a lot of political weight put on the roles of EPA or Department of Agriculture under these bills establishing standards for creating sequestration credits. In your opinion, is this going to make any difference?
I can start. I think it's going to make a huge difference. I mean, first of all, just looking at the EPA right now is very understaffed and they're under-resourced. And they will even say to folks who visit them that they never imagined that they would be in charge of such a comprehensive program. So there does need to be some sort of relationship with the USDA, but it could pose to be a big problem because there are these turf wars between the two organizations, and it certainly will slow things down to develop such a comprehensive policy and have buy-in from both parties. It's going to be amazing to see how long it actually takes for rules to be developed.
I just add one thing to this. The critical thing that the folks who are thinking about the environment at the White House are aware of is exactly what you said. Traditional turf wars have to be eliminated in terms of dealing with the kinds of problems that we're facing there. They're big system-wide problems, and you can't have people working in silos, and you can't have people fighting about who's the right person to do this or where the resources are, just frankly because there's never enough people. There's so much to do, and it's so complicated. So I know this, particularly with large-scale restoration issues, the White House Council on Environmental Quality is very focused on the question of how do you get these agencies to, do what you should do within a large corporate structure, which is figure out who does what best, leverage that, create a bigger product. But if you don't do it, it'll be a total mess.
Just make an observation on that in fact the best research on forest sequestration is all coming out of the Forest Service, which is part of the Department of Agriculture, of course, not EPA. So my opinion, I don't think it makes a big difference. I mean, a lot of people have been saying that agriculture will, in fact, disserve climate change. I think it'll probably will serve agriculture, but I think you're absolutely right about the division. I have some more questions here, but we did want to open the panel up to some audience questions. And when you ask your question, could you please introduce yourself and tell us where you're from and use your microphone?
Yes, I'm Don Brown from Penn State University. Tiffany, given the uncertainty, your presentation included projects which you thought would be approved under some national program, what were the criteria that you used, given the uncertainty, to put projects in that category?
So looking at the bill, looking at the Kerry Boxer and Waxman Markey, when you read through the policy, there are certain things that indicate what might be considered compliance grade, what might not be. I mean, there's no guarantees, but there is some specific language that says that if an offset was developed under a regionalized or a state-recognized program, that it could be grandfathered into the system. So those 9 offsets from CAR would count because they were developed under the Climate Action Registry, which is support from California. And then the ACR, that one project is a little bit iffy. The language has recently changed in the latest revision of the bill, the Kerry Boxer version, where it says that if protocols were peer-reviewed, then that counts as sort of being state or recognized or involving stakeholder processes. So that's another element. Your protocols that the offsets are created have to be created with stakeholder processes. The CCX does not have that. They do that behind closed doors. So that's the language that I was looking at to come up with that list. Thank you.
Any additional comments? Yes.
John from Columbia. My question is to John. Pennsylvania use, 40% of, electricity is using by coal. But at the same time, the state experienced the storm and flooding. Is there any way the state can conserve and store the water during those seasons and use those water to power the electricity so they can cut down the carbon emissions?
That's an interesting question. I think the short answer is no. But a longer answer, and I'll give you an example of how complicated it gets. Some of the areas in Pennsylvania that have been most impacted by flooding have been the southeast corner of the state. The Philadelphia region, where there's a lot of impervious surfaces, you got surface runoff. We happen to own a state park called the Delaware Canal State Park, which is a 60-mile long, 60-foot wide former canal that gets blown out. We've had 3 500-year floods in 5 years, in the first 5 years of this century. The water that blew that canal out was the Delaware. And the upper reaches of the Delaware is where the city of New York gets its drinking water. So there's a big question and a big tug of war about impounding water versus allowing for release to prevent, adverse impacts downstream during heavy rains. Suffice to say that the waterways, not only in Pennsylvania but beyond, you get into some very tricky legal territory, some very hot political water, and you can't draw a border or a line at the border of any particular state. There are cross-state, multi-state issues that go into water management and flood control and things like where you get your drinking water supply from here. So while it's an interesting concept, the ability to just develop storage capacity has huge environmental consequences as well. So I don't think it's really an answer.
Yes.
Hi, Robert O'Sullivan from Climate Focus. A quick question for John. A couple of times you mentioned that the carbon price is too low at the moment, looking at $5 a tonne to support forestry projects in Pennsylvania. What sort of carbon price would be high enough to drive them?
Well, it depends on the project, whether it's an afforestation project, whether it's a land conservation project, whether you're doing fee acquisition or conservation easement, what region of the state you're working in. Land prices are extremely high in the southeast corner, where the state is more developed, and significantly lower elsewhere in the state. So there's a lot of variables at play, and it depends on the specifics of the project. But just notionally, I think the price of carbon has to be north of $50 a ton for it to become a driver. And that's just a real, off the top of my head, ballpark guess. So at least 10 times or more where it is now for it to become a primary economic driver.
I mean, just observe that you're saying primary economic driver because the projects can still go forward, and it may be the marginal addition that drives it. So a much lower price can still drive projects.
I think it's unrealistic to expect a purely carbon price-driven project to be in the offing anytime soon. So any of these types of projects involve an array of financing, a real portfolio of financing instruments. For carbon to be meaningful, it's got to be relatively higher than it is now.
I'll just throw out one thing there. I mean, that you do raise a huge red flag in terms of these big projects where state money is potentially involved with the additionality issue. And if you've got multiple streams of funding, because you've got, we don't have $200 a ton carbon that could actually fund everything. How are the rules in the market going to address that? And that's a big worry.
Sure. So in terms of price, it's tricky because it's just expensive to hire the legal advisors to help your project and the project developers. And so if you look at all the costs and basically it's an economy of scale. So if carbon is $5 a ton and you develop a 10,000 acre project and you're getting about 2 tons per acre, basically the acreages in terms of producing carbon, you can produce between 2 and 6 tons per acre per year. So that gives you the parameters for doing a back of the envelope analysis on price. And the smaller the project, the harder it will be to cover all your costs. Alexa Kelly from World Resources Institute is about to publish a paper on transaction costs involved with offset projects. And so those costs can vary, between $50,000 and $400,000. And so that all goes into it. So I probably won't say much more about sort of the perfect sized project, but you can actually do your own sort of back of the envelope analysis based on how much money you need to bring in to be able to cover your costs and for it to be a good investment.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Johnson. I'm from the Rainforest Alliance. This is a question for John. I believe our organization worked with your department 10 or 15 years ago to become forest certified by the Forest Stewardship Council. I know you talked a lot about conservation easements, but given kind of the climate and ecological and economic benefits of a certification like FSC, what do you think the challenges are of getting the private landowners in your state to become certified?
Those challenges are absolutely enormous. There's no incentive right now in law or contemplated for private forest landowners to take certification seriously. So there's got to be, at the end of the day, an economic driver. Doing it for the good of the order, doing it to be a good citizen of the world is not going to cut it. So there needs to be a very significant economic incentive in play, whether it's a state tax credit and or whether there is the possibility of entering into conservation easements. Somebody's got to put some money on the table. And right now there really isn't anything meaningful to get these folks to pay attention. When you look at the development pressure and how much money, particularly in the southeast portion of the state, how much money you can make selling for McMansion development as opposed to managing your land sustainably. And with the increasing parcelization that I mentioned, the economies of scale come into the picture. So the trend is certainly not going our way in terms of the ability to get landowners interested in sustainable management. So we've got to try to get ahead of the curve somehow, and we're hoping that a carbon price can help us with that.
Yes, in the back.
Can you hear me without the mic? All right. A dual question. One has to do with monitoring and verification of these very desirable practices of carbon storage and sequestration and so on. And that seems to be very, very difficult, and I would like any of the members of the panel to address that. How do you monitor and verify in the face of spatial aerial heterogeneity and the possibility that sequestration over a period of time can then be reversed by changing practices at some future date, and that would obviate the whole process? And the second question has to do with Tiffany. I'd like her to address the issue of forest fires, especially the kind that rage uncontrollably in places like California. and spew out enormous quantities of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. How is that accounted for? Or is there a policy related to this entire complex of climate future?
Well, I can take the second question. Okay, I'll answer the second question and have them answer the first. So forest fires and how are they factored into carbon offset projects? Well, they're factored in almost like any other risk. So let's say you have a landfill and you have a landfill offset project and it's in Arkansas. There's a chance that it could be swept away by a very large tornado. So you deal with forest fires and forest offset carbon projects like any other risks and any other commodities. So in the case of the California Climate Action Registry, you have to take a percentage of your offsets and put them into what's called a buffer pool, which is a buffer pool that is managed for risk. So if there is forest fire that comes and affects some of your credits, those credits they're not factored into your pool that you can sell. The other way that you can address forest fires there are insurance products that are being developed for the marketplace. There's a company called CO2RS, CO2 Resource Solutions. They are one of the only companies that I know in the U.S. market that's supplying insurance for offsets. They are underwritten by Lloyd's of London, and they're just treating this like any other commodity and how you would manage for it. So there are provisions written into the rules for buffer pools. Does that answer?
So can I actually transition there? One of Tiffany brought up before the sort of fixed costs of doing these projects. And then you've got this question of basically insurance and how do you set that up, and then verification and monitoring. These are all elements that in Louisiana have really led us to the opinion, this isn't final, but that you really do need to sort of put in place a program architecture. So for example, one of the tools that might be used for insurance is that if you're already doing a lot of public lands management and you change the way you do that to sequester carbon, maybe you don't sell that, but the state holds that back and says, okay, here's our insurance pool. This is 20% of the overall carbon sequestered, and so you know that if we lose one project here, one project there, that you bought 1.2 tons for your 1 ton, and in fact, it also allows you to possibly take some of the projects where the monitoring and verification costs or the fixed costs of actually setting up all of this are very high, but you know that in general this is going to sequester carbon, and you can again throw that kind of into an insurance pool. That's out there. The verification and monitoring. The other benefit of doing it on a program scale is that generally there are monitoring systems set up. So in Louisiana, there's already a program out there to monitor the health of the wetlands, and actually going back with the state to look at, can we change or add to the things that are being measured out in the wetlands and in the cypress swamps, so that we know the carbon sequestration that's going on out there. So taking advantage of this existing infrastructure, either at the state or at USGS or EPA or NOAA, all of this science that's going on out there, and bringing it together into one package that allows you to monitor the health of this system. And it gets back to that question that I brought up about how you get agencies to work together, and having really establishing a baseline of how this entire ecosystem is functioning, and having each of the agencies driven by that rather than their own particular program imperatives. So they get judged on that, and that's where you might actually get Ag and EPA saying, well, I do this really well. Oh, I do this really well. Okay, let's figure out how those things work together so we're not fighting over it. There's plenty to do. And the third thing is that just verification and monitoring is absolutely the most critical thing here, and it has to be addressed in whatever your protocols are.
And maybe just to put a ribbon on it, from a policy standpoint, at the end of the day, these projects have to be real. They have to actually make an improvement in the atmosphere. And I'll give you an example. We have the largest certified sustainable forest, certainly in the eastern half of the country, if not in the country. The Chicago Climate Exchange has said that certified sustainable forests are deemed approved for trading. So I could this afternoon put 2.1 million acres of state forest land on CCX and generate some significant amount of cash for what? Not having changed one thing in the atmosphere. So the questions of additionality become absolutely critical when you're shaping state policy and certainly federal policy. At the end of the day, these offsets have to be real. And the market has to shake out and the rules have to be set such that these projects are indeed real and will provide meaningful benefit to the atmosphere, reduce the carbon, and do what it is intended to do. So that's one of the fundamental philosophical and policy questions that we have to wrestle with as well.
One of the real problems that was highlighted by what John just said, in structuring what you count in offsets is what you count as your baseline for particularly forestry and ecosystems. I mean, a lot would say, well, shouldn't I get credit for what I've already done in certifying a forest? But that only works if you start trying to do a calculus where you bring in all the forests and start charging landowners if they in fact generate carbon. It becomes enormously difficult. So that is one of the key issues in policy architecture, both internationally and nationally.
I'm interested in what happens if these projects fail. A lot of the environmental community is worried because of storm or bugs or other things. Now, you mentioned the fact that there are insurance instruments but they protect the investor. The environment is not protected if the carbon is re-released. I know in the CDM project, if you, at the end of the verification phase, if it's failed, you have to go back and get other credits, but you've lost the reduced emissions. In the voluntary market, are there mechanisms to protect the environment if these projects fail?
Taking too much credit and making money off offsets that were not removed from the atmosphere.
And the flip side.
Some of the models predict we could have massive dieback of forests, or you could have infant state. I mean, there is a risk here. Is it?
True, but it's only involving those projects that were signed up to receive those kinds of credits. So you are right. I mean, we do have issues of carbon being released from other forests not in an offset cap and trade program. So you're right to look at, it's very important in all of this to look at the overall carbon balance and make sure that we are for sure removing tons from the atmosphere. I mean, that's the only way we're going to mitigate climate change. But I feel like it may be two different issues which you're addressing, which I think are important. I mean, how do you make sure that people are legitimately doing what they're saying they're doing? And then how do we make sure that we're looking at the overall carbon balance and doing everything we can to reduce emissions, maybe outside of a cap and trade program?
I'd also just throw in there, one of the critical things that we've been working on in Louisiana program architecture is being very, very defined about what the likely climate impacts on this ecosystem are. Not doing this based on a static baseline, but understanding how the system is going to change. And the other thing, and it was great to hear John echo this, is that by having the co-benefits be your primary driver of your program, the ecosystem restoration and natural health, you can be assured, as much as you could ever be assured that what you're doing is going to have the most benefits to that system. And if you happen to get carbon and you happen to be able to sell it on the market, boy, it was good that you took advantage of that. But don't let the carbon drive how you're managing the ecosystem. Manage for the ecosystem.
I'll just echo that, being responsible to conserve the state's natural resources. The environment's got to come first for us. So our bar may be relatively higher.
Yeah, but if the system fails, you're giving a disincentive to reduce emissions in other places that would have otherwise been reduced. So the co-benefits doesn't solve that problem, it seems to me. Would you agree with that?
I think we're going to have to, we've gone over and we need to move into the lunch hour now. So perhaps we can continue the discussion in the international section.